3,000 men walked into the Burmese jungle in February 1944 and did not come out again for 5 months. They went in carrying everything they needed to survive on their backs, knowing that there were no roads behind them and no roads ahead of them, knowing that the Japanese controlled every supply line and every river crossing between them and any friendly territory, knowing that if something went badly wrong, there was no realistic way to get them out. They went in anyway. What happened to those men in the 5 months that followed is one of the most extraordinary and least known stories of the entire Second World War. The unit was called the Chindits, after a mythological half-lion, half-eagle creature that guarded Burmese temples, and the name was fitting because what they were being asked to do was not entirely of this world. They were going to march 1,400 miles through some of the most impenetrable jungle on Earth, through mountains with no trails and rivers with no bridges, and valleys filled with malaria and dysentery and Japanese soldiers, and they were going to do it while cutting the supply lines that kept the entire Japanese army in northern Burma alive. No army in history had attempted sustained operations this deep behind enemy lines for this long. No army had ever tried to survive in the Burmese jungle for 5 months without a continuous supply line. Military planners in London and Washington who reviewed the plan were not sure it was possible. Some of them said so out loud. The man who designed this operation and drove it into existence through sheer force of will was one of the most controversial figures in the British military establishment. Brigadier Orde Wingate was not a conventional officer by any measure that the British Army used to measure such things. He was brilliant and abrasive and possibly slightly mad, and he had an absolute burning conviction that the Japanese could be beaten in the jungle if British and Commonwealth soldiers were trained and equipped and led properly. Most of his superiors disagreed with him. Most of them found him exhausting. Most of them were wrong. Wingate had first developed his deep penetration theory in the jungles of Burma in 1943, when he led a first Chindit expedition of around 3,000 men on a 3-month operation behind Japanese lines. The results of that first operation were deeply contested. The Chindits had demonstrated that British and Commonwealth soldiers could operate in the Burmese jungle for extended periods, that they could survive on air supply drops, that they could move faster and strike harder than the Japanese expected. They had also suffered staggering casualties. More than a third of the men who went in never came back. The survivors were physically destroyed, many of them requiring years to recover. The debate over whether the first expedition had been worth the cost never fully resolved. But Wingate had Churchill's ear. In August 1943, he was taken to the Quebec Conference, where Churchill and Roosevelt were meeting with their combined chiefs of staff, and Wingate made his pitch for a second and much larger Chindit operation. He was convincing. Churchill was captivated. The Americans, who were desperate to reopen the supply route to China and break Japanese dominance in northern Burma, saw the Chindits as a way to support Stilwell's ground offensive without committing additional conventional forces they did not have. The second Chindit operation was approved. 6 brigades would go in, over 20,000 men in total, making it the largest deep penetration operation ever attempted. The concept depended on a revolutionary method of supply and movement that Wingate had spent 2 years developing and testing. The Chindits would not carry enough supplies to sustain themselves for the entire operation. They would carry enough for a few days at a time, and the rest would be dropped to them by the Royal Air Force using modified C-47 transports flying over the mountains from India. This air supply system had worked in the first operation, barely. For the second operation, Wingate was betting everything on it working consistently over a 5-month campaign, over terrain where weather and Japanese fighter patrols and simple mechanical failure could cut the lifeline at any point. He was betting the lives of 20,000 men on an air supply system that had never been tested at this scale. The Chindits were organized into columns, self-contained fighting units of roughly 400 men each, designed to move independently through the jungle and reassemble at designated points for major operations. Each column had its own supply officer and radio operator and medical officer, because once they were inside Japanese territory, the column was on its own. There was no way to call for reinforcements. There was no way to evacuate seriously wounded men except by light aircraft to improvised jungle airstrips, and those airstrips had to be hacked out of the jungle by hand under fire. The men of the Chindits understood all of this before they went in. They went in anyway. The training for the second Chindit operation had been brutal by design. Wingate believed that soldiers who had survived training harder than anything the jungle could throw at them would have the psychological reserves to function when things went wrong in the field. The Chindits trained in the jungles of central India for months, learning to move without tracks, to cross rivers without bridges, to live off the land when supply drops failed, to maintain unit cohesion and combat effectiveness when they were exhausted and hungry and sick. They practiced ambushes and demolition and radio communication and the specific techniques of jungle warfare that no training manual had fully figured out because no army had done this before at scale. By February 1944, the plan was ready. The Chindits would be inserted into Burma in 2 ways. Some columns would march in overland from the Lido Road in the north, crossing the Patkai Mountains on foot. The rest, the bulk of the force, would fly in by glider to jungle clearings deep inside Burma, clearings that the advanced scouts had identified from aerial photographs and given code names like Broadway and Piccadilly and Chowringhi. The glider landings would place 9,000 men and all their equipment in the heart of Japanese-controlled Burma in a single night. If the landings went wrong, those men would have no way back. The date was set for the night of March 5, 1944. The night before the operation, aerial reconnaissance photographs arrived at headquarters showing that the Piccadilly landing zone had been blocked. The clearing was covered with logs, hundreds of them, dragged into position by local Burmese villagers who had been using the flat ground to dry their timber. It was not a deliberate Japanese trap. It was an accident of local agricultural practice that had rendered one of the 2 primary insertion points unusable on less than 12 hours' notice. Wingate was informed of this discovery at the command post while the glider pilots were already in their aircraft and the tow ropes were attached and the columns were ready to launch. What Wingate did in the next 2 hours defined the entire operation. He did not abort. He did not delay while he asked permission from higher command. He looked at the photographs and he made a decision. Broadway would absorb the men who had been scheduled for Piccadilly. The landing zone was smaller than planned, and the timeline was tighter than planned, and the risk of collision and pileup was higher than planned, but the operation would go ahead. His staff officers protested that Broadway could not safely handle double the glider traffic in a single night. Wingate told them to make it work. The gliders lifted off into the dark. Broadway was chaos. The first gliders to land found the clearing rougher than the photographs had suggested. with ditches and tree stumps that were invisible from the air and catastrophic for gliders coming in at speed. Aircraft piled up, tow ropes tangled, men were killed and injured in the landings. By midnight, the clearing was blocked with crashed and damaged gliders, and the engineering team that was supposed to prepare the strip for transport aircraft had not yet arrived in sufficient numbers to begin work. Radio messages back to India reported a disaster in progress. Wingate received those messages in India and did not recall the operation. He ordered the landings to continue. By morning on March 6, 1944, despite everything that had gone wrong in the night, Broadway was functional. The engineering teams had worked through the darkness and into the dawn, clearing wreckage and filling holes and leveling the strip enough for transport aircraft to begin landing. The first C-47 touched down at first light. By that evening, over 9,000 Chindit soldiers were inside Japanese-controlled Burma, fed and armed and ready to begin operations. The Japanese knew something had happened in the jungle. Their patrols had heard aircraft. Their scouts had reported unusual activity, but they did not know what or where or how many, and that uncertainty paralyzed them long enough for the Chindits to establish their positions. The strongholds, the defended bases that Wingate had designed as the Chindits' logistical hubs, began to take shape in jungle clearings across a front of hundreds of miles. Broadway became the primary stronghold, with an airstrip capable of handling transport aircraft and a defensive perimeter manned by one brigade, while the other brigades fanned out in columns to begin the work the operation had been designed to accomplish. That work was destroying the railway line that connected Mandalay to Myitkyina, the single supply artery that kept the entire Japanese 18th Division fighting General Stilwell's forces to the north. The columns set out into the jungle. The march was like nothing any of the men had experienced even in training. The central Burmese jungle in March and April is not merely dense, it is an active adversary, a living environment that seems to resist human movement at every level. The undergrowth grabs at equipment and tears at clothing. The ground beneath the tree canopy is a maze of roots and hidden water and sudden drops. The air is so humid that sweat provides no cooling at all, just a constant soaking that rots clothing and boots and causes skin infections at every point of friction. Movement that would take an hour on an English country road takes a day in the Burmese jungle, and that is when nothing is shooting at you. The Japanese were not slow to respond once they understood what was happening. The Chindits' first attacks on the railway were devastating and effective, demolishing bridges and blowing track and overrunning supply depots in actions that were over before Japanese reinforcements could arrive. But Japanese commanders in Burma were experienced jungle fighters who had been in this terrain since 1942 and who understood it in ways that most of the Chindit soldiers, whatever their training, did not yet fully comprehend. The Japanese response was to flood the jungle between the strongholds and the railway with infantry, turning the Chindits' escape routes into killing grounds and surrounding the strongholds with probing forces that tested the perimeters night after night. The nightly Japanese attacks on the Broadway stronghold followed a pattern that the defenders came to know intimately over the weeks of the operation. The attacks would begin after dark, usually between 10 at night and 2 in the morning, with mortar fire onto the perimeter followed by infantry assaults on the weakest-looking sections of the defensive line. The Chindits had mined the approaches and wired the perimeter and dug their positions with the thoroughness that Wingate had demanded in training, and the attacks were repulsed night after night at significant cost to the attackers. but repulsing attacks all night and then marching all day through the jungle while conducting demolition operations and ambushes and all the other tasks the columns had been sent to accomplish, was consuming the men at a rate that had not been fully calculated in the planning stages. Every mile marched in the Burmese jungle cost something that could not be replaced by the next supply drop. Boots wore out and there were no cobblers. Equipment broke and there were no repair shops. Men got sick and there were no hospitals. Malaria swept through the columns as the monsoon season approached, not killing most of the men but reducing them to something far below combat effectiveness, shaking with fever one day and somehow still marching the next because stopping was not an option and the men knew it. The medical officers did what they could with what they had carried in, but what they had carried in was never enough for 5 months of jungle warfare. Wingate died on March 24, 1944, less than 3 weeks after the operation began. His B-25 Mitchell bomber flew into a mountainside in the Naga Hills during a night flight from Imphal, and every man aboard was killed instantly. The impact on the Chindits was immediate and profound. Wingate had been not just the commander of the operation, but its entire animating force, the person who had conceived it and designed it and trained the men for it, and who understood at the deepest level what it required and what it was trying to achieve. His replacement, Major General W.D.A. Lentane, was a capable officer who had commanded a Chindit brigade in the field. But he was not Wingate, and the operation was not designed to be commanded by anyone who was not Wingate. The strategic situation changed almost simultaneously with Wingate's death. The Japanese launched their major offensive into India, Operation Ugo, in early March 1944, driving toward Imphal and Kohima with the intention of cutting the supply line to Stilwell's forces and breaking the back of the Allied position in the theater. Suddenly, the Chindits operation, which had been intended to support an Allied offensive, was happening simultaneously with a massive Japanese offensive, and the entire strategic context around them had shifted. General Stilwell, commanding American and Chinese forces to the north, now saw the Chindits primarily as a force that could support his drive on Mychichina, rather than as a strategic asset operating according to Wingate's original design. This was the moment when the lost battalion situation crystallized. The columns that were furthest inside Burma, the ones that had marched the most miles and demolished the most railway and fought the most engagements, were now being redirected by Stilwell away from their original objectives and toward Mychichina, which was further north and further into Japanese-controlled territory. The men who were already at the ragged edge of their physical limits were being told that the objective had changed and the march was continuing. Lentane, caught between Stilwell's demands and his own knowledge of what his men could and could not sustain, tried to protect the brigades from missions that would destroy them. Stilwell, who despised British officers on principle and had no patience for what he called excuses, overrode him. The story of Brigadier Mike Calvert and the 77th Brigade during this middle phase of the operation stands as one of the most remarkable individual command performances of the Pacific War. Calvert had been with Wingate from the beginning and commanded columns in the first Chindit expedition, and was perhaps the officer in the entire theater who best understood what deep penetration operations required and what they cost. His brigade was tasked with capturing and holding a position called Blackpool, a block on the railway that would cut Japanese supply to the Maichikina area. Calvert took the position. Then he held it for 17 days against Japanese attacks that came in waves, day and night, with artillery that the Chindits had no answer to because they had carried no heavy weapons into the jungle. Blackpool became a siege within the larger operation, a miniature corregidor in the Burmese jungle. The Japanese recognized that the railway block was strangling their supply to the north and committed 3 battalions and artillery to dislodge it. Calvert's men dug deeper and held. They held through monsoon rains that turned their positions into mud trenches and made aircraft supply drops increasingly uncertain. They held while the casualty count climbed, and the medical officer ran out of the drugs needed to treat the wounded, and the fit men were becoming fewer every day. They held because Calvert told them to hold, and because the men trusted Calvert with a completeness born of shared suffering that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. After 17 days, Blackpool had to be abandoned. The Japanese had brought up enough firepower to make the position untenable, and the supply drops had become too unreliable to sustain the garrison. Calvert gave the order to withdraw, and the 77th Brigade moved north in the monsoon rain, carrying their wounded with them, leaving behind everything that could not be carried on a man's back. The men who marched out of Blackpool were not the men who had marched in 3 months earlier. They were thinner by 40 pounds each, and they were sick, and they had been in continuous combat for most of those 3 months. But they were still a functioning military unit, because Calvert had never let them stop being one. The physical deterioration of the Chindit columns during the spring and summer of 1944 was documented in medical reports that made for horrifying reading when they were finally compiled after the operation. The average Chindit soldier lost between 30 and 40 pounds during the campaign, reducing men who had been at peak physical fitness to something that looked more like survivors of a concentration camp than soldiers of a first-class army. Malaria infection rates reached 100% in some columns, meaning that every man was carrying the parasite, regardless of whether he was currently showing symptoms. Typhus and scrub typhus were widespread. Diarrhea was so universal that it was no longer considered an illness, just a condition of existence. The psychological toll was harder to measure, but equally real. Men who had been in the jungle for 4 months without seeing a road or a building or a town began to experience a kind of spatial disconnection, a sense that the world outside the jungle had ceased to exist, and that this green cathedral of heat and rain and Japanese patrols was simply how things were and would always be. The unit diaries from this period describe men doing extraordinary things automatically, ambushing Japanese columns and blowing bridges, and marching 20 miles in a day, but doing them with a blank efficiency that concerned the medical officers who were trained to recognize the signs of combat exhaustion. These men were running on whatever is deeper than willpower. They were running on something that has no good name. If stories like the Chindits matter to you, if men who kept going when every reasonable excuse to stop was available to them matter, if forgotten sacrifice matters,
Subscribe to the Foxhole Chronicles. We tell forgotten stories every week, stories that deserve remembering, heroes that deserve honoring. The Chindits story is one among many more coming. Subscribe and stay with us. Keep these memories alive together.
The Americans of Merrill's Marauders, the United States Army unit operating alongside the Chindits in northern Burma under General Frank Merrill, were experiencing the same deterioration through the same months and in some cases worse. The Marauders had been promised that they would be rotated out after 3 months of combat operations. 3 months became 4. 4 became 5. Men who had been told they were going home were instead sent into another assault, and then another. The assault on Mite Kiana Airfield in May 1944, when Merrill's Marauders seized the airstrip in a surprise attack, was supposed to be the end of the campaign. Instead, it became the beginning of a siege that lasted until August. Stilwell refused to accept that his men were no longer fit for sustained combat operations. When commanders reported that their men were too sick to fight effectively, Stilwell accused them of cowardice. When medical officers submitted reports showing 90% malaria infection rates, Stilwell questioned their professional judgment. The commander of one Marauder unit, Colonel Charles Hunter, submitted a written request to have his unit relieved on medical grounds. Stilwell denied it. Hunter appealed up the chain of command. Stilwell was furious. The men stayed in the jungle and kept fighting and kept dying of things that had nothing to do with Japanese bullets. Mite Kina fell to Allied forces on August 3, 1944, almost exactly 5 months after the first gliders had touched down at Broadway in the dark. The Japanese garrison had been cut off and reduced and finally broken, and the town and airfield that had been the strategic objective of the entire northern Burma campaign were in Allied hands. The price had been extraordinary. Of the 3,000 marauders who had begun the campaign in February, fewer than 200 were still standing at the end, and most of those 200 were themselves carrying malaria or dysentery or both. The unit was effectively destroyed as a fighting force by the campaign it had won. The Chindit situation was similar and in some brigades worse. The 77th Brigade under Calvert had suffered casualties approaching 50%. The 111th Brigade, which had conducted some of the deepest penetration operations, had men who had marched over 1,000 miles through the jungle and fought continuous engagements for 5 months without more than a few days of rest at any point. When these men were finally airlifted out of the jungle strongholds, the transport crews who loaded them onto the aircraft reported that many of the soldiers could not walk unassisted and that their weight was so reduced they had to check twice whether the men were conscious or unconscious. Some of them were simply very quiet, sitting against the aircraft fuselage and staring at nothing, processing 5 months of jungle in their own way and in their own time. The argument over whether the Chindit operations had been worth the cost began almost immediately and has continued in British military historiography ever since. Critics pointed to the casualty rates and asked what had been achieved that conventional operations could not have accomplished with fewer losses. Proponents cited the railway destruction, the Japanese divisions tied down in counter-Chindit operations, the psychological impact on Japanese planning of an enemy that could operate anywhere at any time inside their own rear areas. Stilwell, characteristically,
was contemptuous of the entire enterprise while simultaneously having used the Chindits to support his own offensive objectives for the entire campaign.
The truth, as it usually is in these contested historical arguments, is more complicated than either side wants to acknowledge. The Chindit operations unquestionably disrupted Japanese logistics at a critical period of the war, contributing to the Japanese failure at Imphal and Kohima that proved to be the turning point of the Burma campaign. The destruction of the Myitkyina supply corridor strangled the Japanese 18th Division's ability to resist Stilwell's advance and was a genuine strategic contribution to Allied victory in the theater. These things happened and they mattered, and they would not have happened without the Chindits. What is equally true is that the human cost of achieving those results through deep penetration operations, rather than through conventional infantry assault, was appalling in ways that were not fully anticipated by the planners who approved the second Chindit operation. Wingate had understood this better than anyone. His operational design had included regular rotation of columns, systematic use of the strongholds as rest bases, and a timeline that he believed matched what the men could physically sustain. When Wingate died and Stilwell took effective control of the Chindits' operational employment, those safeguards were stripped away one by one until the columns were being used as conventional infantry in jungle conditions that made conventional operations maximally destructive. General Orde Wingate is buried in Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, which might seem an unusual resting place for a British officer until you understand that he died when his American crewed aircraft flew into a mountain in India, and the wreckage was so complete that the bodies of all 11 men aboard could not be separated. He lies there in the company of Americans because that is where the arithmetic of death put him, and it is somehow fitting for a man who had spent 2 years arguing that British and American and Indian soldiers could operate together in conditions that everyone said were impossible. The men who served under him would have understood the appropriateness of it. The Chindits were disbanded in February 1945, 6 months after the Burma campaign ended, without ceremony and without the public recognition that comparable units in other theaters received. The men went home to Britain and India and Australia and Canada and dispersed into civilian life, carrying with them a campaign that most of their countrymen had never followed and would not follow even after the war, because Burma was always the forgotten theater, the campaign that happened somewhere far away for reasons that were hard to explain in a pub in Birmingham or a kitchen in Liverpool. But the men remembered. The men who had marched 1,400 miles through the Burmese jungle and had come out the other side remembered every step of it with a clarity that did not fade with time. They remembered the weight of the pack and the sound of the rain on the canopy and the smell of the jungle at night when the Japanese patrols were close and every man was absolutely still and absolutely silent. They remembered the faces of the men who had not made it out and the peculiar survivor's guilt that comes from having been standing next to someone who died while you continued to exist. They remembered what it felt like to reach the end of what you thought you could endure, and then to discover that there was more, that there was always more. That is the most important thing the Chindits found in the Burmese jungle, not the railway bridges they destroyed, or the supply depots they burned, or the Japanese battalions they tied down in counter-operations across hundreds of miles of theater. They found out what they were made of. They found it out the hard way, which is the only way it can actually be found out, in conditions that removed every comfort and every convenience and every safety net and left only the essential question. When everything has been stripped away, when the objective is unclear and the leadership is uncertain, and the body has been pushed past every limit it thought it had, what remains? What is left in a man when all the easy things are gone? The answer the Chindits gave, 5 months deep in the Burmese jungle with no way out and no way back, was the same answer soldiers have been giving since there were soldiers. What remains is the man beside you. What remains is the commitment to that man. Everything else is negotiable. That is not.